When it comes to health, all roads lead to mitochondria. That is a quote from my next guest, Kristina Kristen from Harvard's Lifestyle Medicine program, who is going to explain to us the real roots of all diseases and how they're impacting our children and how to protect and nourish our children's mitochondria and our own, because we need lots of energy as parents, of course. Kristina Kristen. She has raised two now college age sons. So when you see her, you will see she practices what she preaches, because this also applies to anti-aging and our health as adults, but particularly for children. The organic food, everything that she talks about that helps to nourish the mitochondria in our cells. And if we can just get this piece right for our kids, we're giving them such a huge advantage for their future health and even childhood health, because epidemics, childhood disease are just off the charts, and it is environmental. I learned when I wrote Primal Parenting book that less than 5% of these diseases, on average, there's differences in different diseases, but Kristina says 5% in a lot of what she has researched in terms of mitochondrial health, only 5% is really genetic. And even that can be inheritance, more so the microbiome and things that are passed down because of environmental insults on our grandparents or our ancestors, that's passed down. So it really is empowering for us parents to realize that we have so much control. We feel like out of control with so much in our parenting lives, right? But we do have a lot more control over how the genome in our kids is expressing. So thank you for joining us. Please drop a comment if you have any inspiration you want to share or anything that resonated with you, questions that you have. We do answer all questions in the comments. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Primal Parenting Podcast, where we bring you the real science so that you can parent with your God-given instincts and apply that instinct to the modern world with informed decisions. And today I'm proud to welcome Kristina Kristen, a lifelong health investigator with a passion for bridging scientific research into daily practices in order to optimize health. Kristina has come out with a brand new book called Beyond Genes, and she hails from Harvard's Lifestyle Medicine program and brings deep biochemical knowledge to the mainstream. Particularly, she is a guru on mitochondria. Welcome, Kristina.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be on your show.
Thank you so much for being here. Did I get that right about the Harvard medicine program?
Yes, it's called Lifestyle Medicine and it's in health and nutrition. That's the credential.
That is so interesting. And so how does that set you apart as a health guru and a biochemical expert in terms of, because you are able to focus in on the cellular function that's the most important?
Well, yes, I think that so currently I'm also a chemistry professor, and I also really have been fascinated and absolutely, I would say obsessed is a better word, with sort of finding the most relevant levers of health that contribute to health. I've been doing that for decades now. So I would say that the credential just was a great underpinning for that. And then the understanding of chemistry also is, obviously it's contributive, but quite frankly, I would say it's really my own just curiosity of reading everything under the sun that
Yes.
has to do with, and the exploration and the curiosity that I would say has brought me to where I am.
Yes. And I can vouch for how deeply you dive into these knowledge bases. I remember when we first met at this organization, which
Yes.
is CHD, because I noticed last time I talked a lot about what they were doing, it got shadow banned. So I'm just
Oh,
trying to be more careful. But we will put a link because they are such an authority. But Kristina and I met through that work. And I remember when I was editing, you did an amazing report on the response to the COVID crisis that was real. It blew me away as a decades long editor about how deep you go in the investigative research on a health topic and how many dots you're able to connect together. So I was really excited for this book. and to have you on to explain more about mitochondrial health and mitochondrial function.
Thank you.
I know that you've your book focuses on mitochondrial function. Just let's start with explaining what is mitochondrial function.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, for all of that. So I would say within my deep dive explorations into, as I said, finding the most relevant, powerful levers of health,
Yes.
every single road always led back to mitochondria. And so when I started to see this emerging pattern, let's just say, I was absolutely, you know, what I wanted to do is to basically delve into the topic even more deeply, and then bring that forth to everybody around me in order to empower everybody in understanding how seminal mitochondria are to our health. So in answer to your question, mitochondria are at the highest level, I would say, they are the interface between our genetics and the environment. And
Yes.
this and as I explain this premise further, you'll see how profound this is. So throughout basically what people know who have heard of mitochondria, they're known as the powerhouses of the cell. They
Right.
are organelles. They are these organelles within the cells, within our cells, that have their own DNA, which is very unique because all the other organelles within our cells are made by the nuclear genome. So our mitochondria actually have their own DNA. They are communicating, signaling, collaborative, a network within ourselves that basically it has become clear in the last 2 decades that they run the show. Are not,
Wow.
so what we know them as, which is the ATP producers, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. That is the currency of energy for every cell. And our mitochondria, yes. So our mitochondria produce the majority of the ATP. So they are the transformers of energy from the food that we eat into ATP. The majority of that is made by our mitochondria. That's why they are coined the powerhouses. But they are so much more than that. That's the bottom line.
Yes. That's kind of, I think, our layman's basic understanding is that our mitochondria fuel our energy, but I think it really is so missing from the information stream that it's so much beyond that, right? It's
Oh, right.
not only your energy level, which is important, but everything that that affects. And I love the way that you position that. And so, are you? Does that mean epigenetics? Is that how epigenetics happens? Because we know epigenetics is really the real genetics. It is genetics. It's all almost entirely epigenetic, right?
You hit it on the nail. You hit it on the nail. It is through the mitochondrial communication, the signaling, the reactive oxygen species,
Wow.
they're regulating the calcium levels in the cells, the apoptosis and all that. What they are capable of doing is actually the turning on and off the epigenetics of the cell, and they are the force behind which epigenetics actually continues and functions. So basically they are the interface, as I mentioned before, between your genetics and the environment.
That's so brilliant because I think people think of genetics as everything. And you mentioned also in your book, you talk about how the research behind diseases is so focused on genetics when it really should be focused on the epigenetic effects. Do you want to talk a little bit about the research behind diseases?
Very much so, very much so. If you were to look into the science, into the voluminous mountains of growing number of studies that have showed very clearly that the lifestyle illnesses such as cancer, heart disease, even the Parkinson's, dementia, diabetes, all of these, what we call lifestyle illnesses, at the very fulcrum, the very epicenter of these lifestyle illnesses are mitochondria and the mitochondrial dysfunction behind them. When you think
Wow.
about it, Yeah, absolutely. So when you,
Amazing.
it's astounding. Complete contrast to that, the majority of funding for studies continues to be focused, I would say, sort of disproportionately for sure, on trying to come up with cures that are focused mainly on genetics and mutations. And so we have not really had a lot of progress, not I, clearly from the numbers, the abysmal numbers of those who are suffering from the chronic illnesses, the epidemic of chronic illnesses that we currently have in the US. We have not had a huge advancement in treating these chronic illnesses with the current framing of health and disease that exists within the paradigm of Western medicine. And
Right, and what they're funding. So why do you think, just so that we can understand the dynamics, if the funding is going more toward genetic research, but that's not helping, why do they keep putting the funding there instead of in the direction that you are illuminating, which is the mitochondria?
that's the $1 million question. I mean, you do have these luminaries. I just want to name a few of them if anybody wants to go and research for themselves.
Yes, please.
So you have Dr. Thomas Seyfried, you have Vamsi Muta, you have Douglas Wallace, you have the prior work of Pete Peterson. There's just a voluminous number of people who are screaming from the rooftop saying, hey, what are we doing here? Why are we not looking into the root causes, the real root causes of these diseases, which are mitochondrial dysfunction? And why are we continuing to fund projects that are focused on shutting down symptoms and basically, for example, when it comes to cancer, looking for genetic mutations and stopping those genetic mutations when it is clear from the work of Dr. Thomas Seyfried that those are downstream effects. The genetic mutations that happen, the gene mutations that happen, for example, in cancer, they're downstream effects from the mitochondrial dysfunction, that the mitochondria that are damaged. So, and I think that to your answer, why is this happening? I would say in science, when we think about science, the ideal notion of science is that it's pursuing truth at any cost. But
We would hope so, right?
that's the ideal. We hope that when new ideas come up and they are more compelling than older ideas, that they become assimilated and they get embraced. But unfortunately, that is not the case. I would say three things contribute to that: economic incentives,
Okay.
ego, and entrenchment, ideology and entrenched ideology. There's almost like an invisible dome of dogma that
Mhm.
that basically it encapsulates science. And there's a very famous book, it's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, that came out in way back, like decades ago. And I think it's a brilliant work that speaks to exactly what you're talking about, that in science, progress is actually very slow. And
Yeah.
it is because of exactly these dynamics.
Okay. Okay. So parents really have to be aware that the science that they hear from the media isn't always the real science.
Absolutely. Yes, I
Yeah.
think that's unfortunately the case.
I
Yeah.
had that rude awakening as a mom, which was part of the impetus to write Primal Parenting, the book that I learned so much about epigenetics for that, how it just applies to social and emotional health and development. Have you, in your research, learned anything specific about avoiding distress, emotional regulation, and some of the challenges we come up against as parents in the early years, especially, that could affect, do those kind of stressors affect the mitochondrial development as well?
Very much so. Very much so. So one of the key elements that has been studied and shown to be destructive and harmful and damaging to mitochondria is this chronic stress.
Mm,
Not acute stress, but chronic stress. As we
right,
know,
okay.
this is not anything new, but the mechanism by which it works is fascinating, because actually it's within the mitochondria themselves that they produce the cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone. So for
Yes.
in terms of an evolutionary biological need for that, it was absolutely necessary when we were being chased by tigers or lions or some acute very dangerous situation had
Sure.
cropped up. You had to be able to crank up your mitochondria, your energy production, in order to escape the threat. So the cortisol would pump in and your mitochondria would be charged up and you would be able to run away and survive. But
Yes.
as you can imagine, first of all, so when you rev up your mitochondria, the reactive oxygen species are, when they're in a decent amount, they're actually very beneficial. But when there's too much reactive oxygen species, these harmful molecules, then it actually damages your mitochondria and your cells.
Oh, wow. I've never heard it explained like that before. That's so brilliant because we kind of know that stress is damaging, but to break down the mechanism like that so simply is beautiful. Thank you for that
Of
explanation.
course. Of course.
Because we talk a lot on primal parenting about avoiding chronic distress for the children because their brains are developing. And for example, they've done MRIs on little baby boys getting circumcision and how that changes the brain. And so there's structural changes. And then the cry it out sleep training is something that we try to educate parents about the real science, showing that, like in studies, you mentioned the cortisol, how it goes up when the baby is left crying without a response, and then they will eventually stop crying for the parent. But then when they measured the cortisol levels were still off the chart, so they're just disassociating and stuffing those emotions. And now you've just added a whole layer to that, of that is actually happening inside the mitochondria. Wow. Then what is the process that could lead later to diseases, mental disorders, or physical, I guess?
So this kind of ties into, I'm preemptively going into just a tangent, but you'll see why.
Yes, please do.
So there's a whole science now, and there's an understanding that mitochondria contribute to disease and illness. And the reasoning behind that, essentially, or the function and what happens in terms of the contributing factors to that, are these reactive oxygen species, where if you have too much stress on the mitochondria from whatever variables, it could be, the cortisol, but it could also be poor nutrition. It could also be a sedentary lifestyle. It could be toxin exposure. All of these variables can contribute to this reactive oxygen species, which degrade our mitochondria. And therefore, within each cell, whether it's in the brain cell or it's in the liver cell or kidney cell or whatever particularly specialized cell we're talking about, when the mitochondria are stressed and damaged, that contributes to suboptimal functioning of that tissue. So in terms of the cortisol factor, for example, if you have an over hyperactivated mitochondria for too long, just by the mere fact that it's functioning at this overstimulated state, you're going to create reactive oxygen species that then degrades whatever tissue, the cell and then the tissue that you're talking about, that can contribute to all sorts of symptoms depending on the person themselves. We're very unique.
Yeah.
But the symptoms will be some sort of dysfunction.
Wow, that's so incredible. So the book again that Kristina Kristen has just released is called Beyond Just Genes: Welcome to the Energetic Revolution. Ignite your mitochondria engines to revitalize your body, conquer weight, and defy aging. Of course, us moms are interested in the anti-aging parts of it, but in terms of child development, especially, what can parents do? What are the most important things that we need to do for our little ones to help protect their mitochondria from this stress, whether it's emotional or environmental or food? What do you think the top things for parents to know are?
That's such a great question. So I like to break it down into, let's just say there are 5 pillars of concentration that you need to sort of have on your radar, starting with nutrition, exercise, then you have stress, sleep, and toxin avoidance.
Mm.
So those are the 5 pillars that you absolutely have to just have an awareness around. And so for your mitochondrial health, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you've optimized all of those pillars, let's say, in the best way possible. So
Mm.
when you talk about nutrition, for example, I mean, we're talking about young children now. So I don't know what ages we're talking about, but if
Yes, primal parenting is focused more on the first 5 years, but we cover all the developmental stages.
okay. I mean, so for nutrition, it's absolutely make sure that you are optimizing the nutrition, whole, organic, real foods. Of course, if it's possible to nurse within the first year, that's absolutely wonderful. That's the best food the infant can get, obviously, for very, very real reasons. And so, real, whole, organic, unprocessed foods really minimize the sugar, really minimize the any sort of, I hope I don't even have to say this, but sodas and
Right.
excessive carbs and so on, and concentrate on the good oils and good fruits, veggies, and all of the spectrum of foods that you basically, you want to think of it as a multivitamin that you're taking in the form of food every day. Uh,
Should kids take a multivitamin or just try to get more from food?
I meant it ideally to be gotten through food.
Mhm.
So think about, the array of colors and, like textures and so on that we think of as the Mediterranean diet. That's
Yeah.
really the ideal diet because you're getting a cornucopia of so many elements within that diet. But I know that the age limit, so obviously they're between the ages of 0 to 1, you're talking about a different element than, let's say, 2 to 5. In
Well,
terms,
breastfeeding, right? So I wanted to throw in that I really am such a huge proponent of extended breastfeeding too. It's something I researched a lot for my book, and I found that what's really biologically normal is years of breastfeeding, not months. Is there anything more specific related to the mitochondria and breast milk that you want to talk about?
you know, um, I personally, if I can share this, I breastfed both of my boys and I did it for an extended amount of time. I would say in today's world, 2 years for one and 1.5 years for the other. Yeah. And it's an evolving, they're, the more they look into it, the more they discover new elements in the breast milk. So I would say, but when you look at the makeup of the breast milk, it's literally the ideal food and biologically so. And it's actually what we've also discovered is that it's not static, right? It's actually the mother through breastfeeding is communicating with the child through breastfeeding, and the breast milk changes according to the child's needs, going from the colostrum, as you know, all the way to, initially it's just the colostrum, and then, but even in the first year the milk is not static, it actually transforms and changes and adapts to the needs of the child. Where can you find that?
Right.
How can one substitute something like that? You know,
Yes, and just the way that it functions as the baby's immune system by picking up pathogens from the baby's mouth and then telling the mother's immune system to make antibodies for that particular pathogen. And the gut health element, which I think ties into everything that you're writing about too, right? Like protecting and sealing the gut. How does that relate to mitochondrial function?
it's all related, right? I mean, the gut health, as we, so people have become more aware of the gut health, I would say,
Mhm.
as you well know, in the last 2 decades, where before it was not as front and center as it is now. We can almost think of it as, I know this is a crazy thought, but we are outnumbered actually within our own body, in our own cells, by this ecosystem that is in us, within us, on our skin, in our gut. We're outnumbered by this ecosystem. We are a living ecosystem, right? So
Yeah.
we want to make sure that everything that we do is actually supportive of the diversity and the needs of this ecosystem, that actually it's a symbiotic relationship, just as our mitochondria within our cells have a symbiotic relationship with us. Our gut microbiome has a symbiotic relationship with our organism. It's almost like you cannot separate mitochondria from anything because it's really at the heart and core of energy and energy production within the cell that runs that cell. So the deficit of energy, when the cell needs a certain amount of energy and it's not met, that contribute to mitochondrial dysfunction, that's where you get into trouble. And that applies to the gut as well.
That makes so much sense. So it's always coming back to the assaults on the cell, but what about detox? I don't think people realize just how important cellular detox is in our modern world. How does the mitochondria detox itself?
I just love that question because one of the greatest variables and contributing factors to mitochondrial damage are toxins.
Right.
I would even argue that when I talked about the 5 pillars: nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress management, and toxin avoidance, this may be unorthodox and an unpopular opinion, but I would even put the avoidance of toxins as the number 1 pillar.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
the reason is, think about it. This is how I think of it in my mind, and you can tell me what your thoughts are. But the way I process it is, you could be eating the best, healthiest, most organic food for years, for 2 decades, let's just say, and doing all the optimal things that you could be doing, exercising, sleep management, and all of that. But one day, just one day of eating something that is highly, or being exposed to something that is highly toxic, could literally kill you. So
Mm,
this is an important element to stress. And what I'm trying to say is avoidance, just the whole idea of prevention. Prevention is so much more powerful than trying to reverse something. An
mhm.
ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So
I love that, especially for children because they're developing.
sorry. So especially for children, you want to do your due diligence on everything in order to maintain the integrity, the fidelity of their tissue, their organs, their being, their essence. Because and by that, you do have to, it's caveat emptor, buyer beware. Everything that you touch that comes, that is comes into the, let's say, surrounding environment of your children, to the extent that it's possible that you can control, you
Mhm.
should be vigilant about trying to mitigate any of the toxins that can harm their mitochondria. And by that, I mean the food, of course, the EMF, the electromagnetic fields that we're all exposed to. You want to make sure they're getting enough and adequate movement. And then really being hyper vigilant in, for example, any of the uh, medications or injections or whatever it is that they're given. How does that affect their mitochondrial health? Because if any of those items are actually damaging their mitochondria, there really needs to be some very, very important and significant reason that you would do that. And if
Yes.
yeah,
Thank you so much for mentioning that, and we point to this organization, we'll say CHD, but we'll put it in the notes because they are such an amazing resource for some of those medical products that damage cells and really have done a number on our children's health in this country and other countries, but especially in our country. That's so important. It's like you said, you can do everything else right, and then you get convinced to do one of these medical, and sometimes it's medicines, like our children are more medicated than ever in this country. And we have to always, I love the short reel that you had people asking, but is it good for my mitochondria? Everything that goes, like touches our body or goes inside our bodies, we have to ask, what is that doing to their mitochondria? So in the pediatrician's office, we parents, we need to be asking, is that good for my child's mitochondria, right?
that is Angela, that is the reframing. That's what my desire for writing, my entire inspiration to write this book, is to reframe the the exact question of what fosters health. And
Mhm.
so it makes it so much more simple and not confusing when you have this formulation and understanding of what is the highest and most significant contributor to your health? And that is your bioengine. That
Mm.
is your mitochondria. And
Mitochondria matters.
mitochondria matters.
Yeah.
It really does matter. And it's really interesting and fascinating in so many ways, because the disconnect between how foundational they are, if I can just make an example or give an example, when we think about a car, airplane, or a ship, or anything that
Mhm.
has to have an engine for it to function. If you were to ask, let's say, 99 out of 100 people, what is the most important part of a car? I would say almost virtually every single person would say, if the engine doesn't work, you're not going to buy the car, because you want the car to be able to run,
Yeah.
right? So this disconnect between the most important engines are your own bioengines, and yet hardly anyone has heard of mitochondria. And when was the last time you went to a doctor and they talked about your own bioengines? It's just not a topic of conversation.
It's not. It's just the conversations that they want to have are about pharmaceutical interventions.
Yes.
So let's go a little deeper, Kristen, into diet. So you've said the Mediterranean diet. I think that there's a lot of confusion out there about the Mediterranean diet versus the carnivore, more of a carnivore approach. What do you have to say about that? Is it just the issue of organic and like what chemicals are used on the produce, or is there more to it than that in terms of mitochondrial health?
That's a very good question. And where I've landed with this is, you
Mhm.
can look at all the data and all the research, and they have actually, there's a pretty voluminous amount of data that shows that for mitochondrial health specifically. And when we talk about mitochondrial health, so we're talking about the ability for the mitochondria to do fission, fusion, biogenesis, and what's called mitophagy. These are the major, let's say, adaptive qualities that you want to make sure the mitochondria can do: that they can fuse, they can separate, they can reproduce, and they can clean themselves out. If
Mm,
any one of those processes are somehow not done appropriately, or they're somehow suboptimal, it eventually leads to the mitochondria not being able to function appropriately or properly. So when they studied the different diets across the board, whether you're talking about the keto diet, carnivore diet, calorie restricted diet, obviously the Mediterranean diet, and they looked at those diets, trying to basically measure the mitochondrial health as it pertains to that diet. Hands down, because you have this diversity of plants, which give you the phytonutrients, phytochemicals, the immune supporting molecules that are abundant within the Mediterranean diet. And you also have the healthy fats. You have the whole foods. It's not processed foods, which makes it easy.
right.
Yes. So you have all of these combined elements that come together, let's say cultures around the world that have success and do live long lives. As we know, the blue zones, for example, you have these 5 areas around the world where you have centenarians, people who live well into their hundreds and are active and vibrant. They essentially, not all of them have Mediterranean diets. They have the whole food diet.
Mhm.
They embrace the whole food diet. If you can see that it's working, and it's certainly not diminishing their lives,
Right.
eh, there has to be a contributing factor of health there.
Yes. Yes. I think that where it becomes challenging is in some of those countries, they don't have the same agrochemicals that we do in this country, right?
Yes. Yes.
So if parents in our country are following Mediterranean diet, what do they need to be aware of to select those fruits and vegetables that will not cause inflammation because of the chemicals?
In a few of my short videos, I touch upon that. And it's not about the food itself. It's
Mm,
about, where did it come from? How was it processed? By the time it was grown and it gets to you, you need to know not only what you're eating, but what it ate. If you're
Oh.
consuming meat, you need to know what did it eat.
What should the meats have been fed?
So the clean, I mean, obviously we want we don't want a CAFO derived, let's say meat from a cow that's been fed antibiotics and GMO corn and
Mhm.
so on. So you want to ideally, let's say if you're consuming red meat, it needs to come from a grass-fed cow, right? So
CAFMO, just so our audience knows, is the confinement feed. What is the acronym?
CAFO stands for
Basically, the confined animals are confined and
confined
basically,
animal feed something. Yes,
yeah,
it's a
they're
basic.
just feeding on, they're not, it's not a natural food for them, right?
Well, they're confined and sick. So the cows are basically they're industrialized to the extent that they're just fed antibiotics just to keep them alive. And they're
Right.
fed diets and the reason for that is because they're essentially fed diets that they normally would not consume. So in order for them to be kept alive, they have to basically intervene in ways that are just not
Antibiotics.
exactly.
And then do the antibiotics in the meat affect our mitochondria?
Yes, absolutely. So, oh, that's a great question because the other thing to keep in mind is we all know that when we consume an antibiotic, which at times is necessary,
Sure.
there are acute situations where we do need to take an antibiotic. And by now it's clear and we know that the antibiotic actually affects the diversity of our gut microbiome, right? So many people know this and they then take the probiotics or they're conscious of reestablishing the diversity of their microbiome post an antibiotic, right? But what
Yes.
is but what is not known to most, this is absolutely fascinating, and this blew my mind actually, is that mitochondria, they used to be autonomous bacteria. So our
Oh,
own,
wow.
our own mitochondria are actually the remnants. They still have the circular DNA. They're actually ancient bacteria that are living there.
Wow.
They're a cell within our cell. So
Amazing.
so when you take an antibiotic, actually, the way they actually work is that they go after some of the functions and the structures of bacteria. So guess
Wow. Oh my
what?
gosh. Yeah, that is mind blowing.
So that is mind blowing because not only does it affect the gut microbiome, which is not within your cell, but it's part of your gut, but they
Yeah.
actually can have adverse effects on your own mitochondria, which are in your cells.
Wow. That is so insightful. You mentioned the functions of the mitochondria that have to work, and the one that caught my attention because I've been researching this. I actually will put a screenshot of another podcast I did with Layla Sentner because she has a wellness center. She was talking about like the Patricia Kane protocol and how that those types of healthy fats help the cell detox. Maybe you could talk about healthy fats and what kinds of fatty foods are best for children and adults too, but if there's a difference.
Uh, as we've all sort of been hearing in the last, I would say, more 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years now, the seed oils, the seed oils, seed oils. When I think, should avoid seed oils.
Mhm.
They're highly inflammatory. The processing, if you look at the processing, by the time it gets to you, I don't think anyone who actually would see this processing would ever touch the final product because it has had so many degradations and alterations and you know chemicalization before it gets to you that it's really not. I would even say it's like a fake oil by the time it gets to you. So to the extent
Yes,
it's possible,
a
uh,
frankenfood. It's a franken.
it's frankenfood. So I would say it is true that we should be avoiding seed oils. We should be trying to consume the healthiest form of fats in the form of olive oil. The extra virgin olive oil is actually extremely healthy. There are a multitude of studies that show that. Um, And the grass-fed butter, the ghee, the whole milk. Obviously, you want to maintain the integrity of the whole food, and that fatty part of it is actually extremely healthy. Consuming meats that have had, let's just say, they come from healthy backgrounds, consuming the fat portions of them is actually quite salutary. You have the coconut, for those who aren't, not for children, I would imagine, but for those who are, let's say, vegan or they don't consume a lot of meat, the coconut oil is actually very healthy. It gives you a good amount of saturated fat. And so I would just say it's very common sense in terms of the approach is it organic? Does it come from what was the processing? That the real question is not what is it, but what was the processing before it got to you?
Yes, so we really have to source our foods.
Yes.
Yeah,
Very.
we really have to know the sources. We wanted to talk about the diabetic epidemic in children, and you mentioned some of the other diseases and disorders of childhood, but what can you tell us about the mitochondrial origins or the mitochondrial health related to diabetes, cancer, childhood diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, which they used to not be even heard of in children. And now we have 1/3 of children are pre-diabetic in this country. What is going on with that?
Yeah, it's so Angela, the CDC came out with a report, and they basically did a study and reviewed the work from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is this long running survey that looked at specifically in this report adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17. And they ran blood work and essentially analyzed two biomarkers. And one was fasting glucose, and the other one was the hemoglobin A1C numbers. And the results from this study are just catastrophic, because what it showed was that 1 out of 3 adolescents within this age group of 12 to 17 are pre-diabetic. And the measure of that was that their fasting glucose was between 100 to 126 milligrams per deciliter.
Wow.
This is catastrophic. And their
That
A1.
is tragic. What is behind that in terms of the mitochondrial function?
Well, as you mentioned initially, let's say in the 1950s or 60s, a pediatrician would almost never see a pre-diabetic or a diabetic child. It was unheard of.
Mhm.
Type 2 diabetes was essentially the disease of the elderly. And to have these numbers in, so 8.4 million adolescents today between the ages of 12 to 17 are pre-diabetic, virtually diabetic, I would say. And what this means is first of all, diabetes is a metabolic disease. Metabolism
Mhm.
is your mitochondria. When people
Wow.
talk about metabolism is what your mitochondria do. That is the function of breaking down the food and creating ATP. That is in the essence of metabolism. So what this means is they have dysfunctional mitochondria. They
Mm.
and the culprits, I would say, are toxins and lack of nutrition and a sedentary lifestyle. These children are not getting proper nutrition. They're getting predominantly ultra processed food with too much sugar, too many carbs, too many probably seed oils, who's who of toxins that they're exposed to. And so when we age, the reason it takes decades for us to age, and so it's a progression, is because it's cumulative. The damages to our mitochondria are cumulative through time. So what's happening now with our children is they're getting this, over accumulation of toxins early. So their mitochondria are damaged by the time it could be as early as infancy through adolescence,
Right.
when they should be healthy.
Yeah, and the study, like you said, it was 12 to 17. So but by the time they're 12 to 17, we're already seeing these problems. So what about cancer? You talk about cancer in your book. Do you want to share anything about the mitochondrial influence in that?
Yeah, I just want to re-mention Thomas Seyfried. Dr. Thomas Seyfried, he works in Boston College, and he is a luminary, and he wrote the book Cancer is a Metabolic Illness. And
Wow. Okay,
what
we can link that.
and
Absolutely.
and what he has been able to do is, first of all, he's screaming from the rooftops that cancer is a metabolic illness, it's not genetic mutations. And in addition to that, what he's been able to accomplish is through a treatment that considers mitochondria, he has been able to substantially help terminal cancer patients who have either brain cancer or pancreatic cancer, where they were given, let's say, months to live. They've been able to live over a decade. And his process, his treatment has been essentially cutting off the two main fuels for cancer cells, which are glutamine and glucose, in a very strategic way. And
Wow.
what he's saying is, there's no question that cancer, also the majority of cancer, there are those that have a predisposition, less than 5% that have a predisposition of genetics, pure
Mhm.
genetics. But the majority of cancers are again metabolic. They have to do with dysfunctional mitochondria. So what his treatment does is he focuses on mitochondria, mitochondrial health, and also cutting off the main food supply to the cancer cells and processing it through the lens of metabolism and mitochondria. And he's had tremendous success. And yet he's saying, why are we continuing to give billions and billions and billions in cancer
Yes.
research to new
Mm.
treatments and stopping?
Exactly. That's a really good endpoint because it's just really emphasizes how we have to go back to the basics and the root causes. And you mentioned that we're outnumbered. I wanted to clarify for our audience what you're talking about, the bacteria. It's 10 to 1, right? And we
Oh,
have to take care of our bacteria, which you've also illuminated as part of the mitochondria. So that's just such good information. Again, the book is called Beyond Just Genes, and you can find it on Amazon. Where else, Christina?
it's on Amazon. And also, I wanted to just mention my social media handles. I'm at Kristina Kristen Wellness, if anybody wants to follow me.
Excellent. So we'll put all those in the description. And thank you so much for sharing the real science with us today on primal parenting.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's been a great pleasure. Great to see you.
For joining us on the Primal Parenting Podcast. This episode with Kristina Kristen has been so enlightening. Please share what your biggest takeaway was. What can you do today to help protect your child's mitochondria, the health of your child's mitochondria? If there have been stressors that you know your child's little body has taken in terms of medical interventions, what are those things that you can look back and say, okay, this was probably damaging my child's mitochondria? What can I do to help repair it? And you can find all that information, of course, in Kristina's new book, Beyond Just Genes. Thank you. And we'll see you next time on the Primal Parenting Podcast.